According to some, the term fascism arose from the Roman symbol of the fasces, which is shown in the slide as a bundle of reeds or sticks bound together. And in this case, it has a hatchet or an axe bound in the center. And the idea behind this, at least according to some, is that individually we're like a reed or a stick. On our own, we can easily be broken and shattered, but bound together, we are strong. And so that is kind of the, at least according to some, the origin of the term fascism. Now, fascism itself originated as a concept, most likely around the 19th century, and was made famous, of course, by Benito Mussolini, and truly famous by Adolf Hitler. And fascism, of course, is still around today. Now, in the United States, the use of the term fascism, also perhaps in the world, has, gotten, in many ways, kind of, you might say, unprincipled or unfounded. How so? Well, often in the United States, not surprisingly, since fascism is a right-leaning political view, that the right is often characterized as fascist. For example, George Bush, the second one, he was called fascist, sometimes neo-fascist. And he also tried to, interestingly enough, Bush tried to label Islam as Islamo-fascism, which is, when we look at the definition of fascism, is kind of an unusual thing to claim. Now, more recently, people on the right have been attempting to claim that the left is fascist, and they often point to the claim that the Nazis were the National Socialists. But of course, anyone who does history and looks at the actual facts will note that the Nazis, despite their appropriation of the term socialism, the national, they were a right-wing, political ideology, not left. Now, some have claimed that because fascism has been, overused, the term overused so much, that's come to mean just something bad. So everyone just sort of throws it around. So Obama was called a fascist. We have Bush being called a fascist, Trump being called a fascist. And if everybody's, being called a fascist, it loses some of its, power and meaning. So why does the definition matter? Well, one problem, obviously, is the misuse of the term, because if people are just throwing around the term fascist just to mean something bad, it kind of loses its, kind of significance and importance. So how do we decide, what the word means? Well, this does raise some important philosophical questions about the philosophy of language, and some people do approach this sincerely, trying to address the question of, when does the meaning of a word justifiably shift? And other people approach it on the right because they want to stick the term fascism because it is a bad, denotation to it, a bad emotional implication. They want to stick that onto the left. So how do we decide? Well, one thing, of course, is the clear history of the term. I mean, true, the meaning of terms can change over time, but the history of fascism nicely lays out, what it is. It's a right-wing political view that has certain characteristics. Noting, of course, to be honest and fair, the terms can change over time. And so we are well advised to, heed the point Locke made, which was, people can use words as they wish, but if we're going to have a coherent, meaningful discussion, we have to be clear about what we mean. And not surprisingly, people attempt to use various rhetorical devices, shifting the words around, and using them in bad faith to just, pretend like they don't get the history, and just using the term fascism as something bad, and sticking on those who don't deserve it. So, how should we define fascism? Well, a sensible way to approach it is, again, looking at the history and usage of the term. And this, of course, is subject to debate, hopefully in good faith as opposed to bad faith. And we can look at those who created fascism and who claimed it to see what fascism is. Now, if people decide to, make it mean something else, then we need a new term to refer to what all of this refers to. And so simply moving the words around doesn't change the concepts, it just changes the words. So let's head on to one of the original developers of fascism, Benito Mussolini. So some background for Benito Mussolini. He was born in Italy in 1883, and he became the leader of Italy in 1922, and he was overthrown in 1943. His main claim to fame is transforming Italy into a fascist state. He joined Nazi Germany in making war of Europe, and was overthrown, as noted, in 1943, and was killed by his own people in 1945. And he wrote, well before he died, he wrote an essay along with another person on fascism. And so one way to see what fascism is to go right to the mouth of the fascist. What do fascists think fascism is? So without further ado, on to Mussolini's conception of fascism. So according to Mussolini and his co-author, fascism has many key characteristics. Now, there is no Bureau of Standards of fascism, which defines that all fascists must accept these, and it's a political ideology, and it doesn't have very deep intellectual roots that really lay out the foundations of it, and so actual particular fascists will vary quite a bit, which is true of any political ideology. So Mussolini's view, here are some of the characteristics of fascism, and these seem to be generally accepted by all who claim fascism. The first thing is peace. They reject that. Now, the fascist view of peace is as follows. First, they believe that perpetual peace is impossible. It just cannot occur. Now, in this, they may be correct, because if you look at the history of humanity and try to find periods without war and conflict, you probably would not be able to do so, unless you sort of define conflicts in a way that excludes smaller scale things. Because right now, there are many wars going on, and we generally think of like the big wars, World War I, World War II, but there's been pretty much perpetual war. So perhaps the fascists are right about this. Secondly, even if it was possible to have perpetual peace, they reject that. They believe it would not be of value. So even if we could do it, which they claim we cannot, it would not be a good thing to do. So they reject pacifism, the idea of not fighting. So part of this rejection of peace is rejection of pacifism, because they regard pacifism, again not being violent, as giving up struggle, and they regard it as cowardice in the face of sacrifice. So their core view of peace is perpetual peace is impossible. Even if it were possible, it would be undesirable. So then, if they don't like peace, what do they like? Well, it should be not surprising that they value war. Why? One reason is this. They claim that it brings human energy to its highest tension, really brings out energy in people. Now, on one hand, this does seem true in some cases. People, in the case of war, often people do get very energized. Also, there's the fact that if you look at the history of, say, technological advancement, wars tend to lead to, very strong burst in technology. If we look at, for example, the Civil War, the United States, that helped really push the railroad, the telegraph, gave rise to what we now recognize as, iron. Well, now they're steel and stuff, but the rise of the ironclads, the conception of modern powered warships with turrets and armored hulls, and then of course World War I. We get the real push to developing aircraft, submarines, and other technology. Then World War II, even more stuff, and much of what we develop today, a lot of it is for some form of warfare. So that part seems true-ish. secondly, and this is a common conception, not just limited to fascism, that war puts, a stamp of nobility on people, that it allows people to engage in, a great decision and engage in like this greatness. Now, again, this is not limited to fascism. For example, it's very interesting to look at early letters written, say, like around the American Civil War. And you hear kind of like optimism and how excited people are initially to get out there and fight. And so you find, for example, the Confederate soldiers writing about how they're going to, whoop the Yankees and be back home in time to, do, I guess, slavery stuff. And then you hear the Union soldiers writing about how they're going to whip the rebels and be back home, right away. And so initially, people are talking about how much fun the war is going to be. And at the start of the war, people would, according to some historical stories, would go with picnics to watch the battles. And then, of course, in reality, it turned out to not be that. It becomes just, horror and terrible. And so there is kind of a refutation here of fascism that, true, war does give people a chance to be courageous and noble. But it also is horrific. And it also gives people a chance to be truly horrific in the form of war crimes. So the fascists are very much against peace, regarding it as impossible and undesirable, and favoring war. Now, given this focus on war, one might believe that the fascist is about suicide. Now, according to Mussolini at least, the fascist loves life and despises suicide. And historically, this seems to have been borne out, at least in the case of, Nazi Germany, fascist Germany, because if you're familiar with, the end of World War II, the Japanese had the kamikaze program where they would load aircraft with bombs and have a pilot fly into American ships, which proved very effectively. I mean, they were early guided missiles with a guidance system as a human being. They also had submarines, essentially torpedoes, and that would be directed by a person. Now, the Germans were given the opportunity to also do this, to use like suicide attacks, but in large part, they did not do this. I mean, they fought, through the streets of Berlin to the end, and Hitler committed suicide, of course, but for the most part, the German military did not embrace that. So perhaps, at least in the historical context, in regards to the German fascist and Italian fascist, they did not embrace suicide, except for Hitler, of course. So why does the fascist reject suicide and love life? Well, it's not a, kind of like a tie-dyed flowers and rainbows love of life. Very different. Because the fascist, according to Mussolini, looks at life as duty, struggle, conquest, and above all for others. So they love life and oppose suicide, not for tie-dyed, flowered, rainbow, unicorn reasons, but because on this conception, your life belongs to others. And presumably it would be a failure of duty, struggle, conquest, and a failure to others for one to commit suicide. So it's not pro-life in a sense of valuing life, in the very positive sense. It's more of a, you must value your life because you owe it to others. Now, not surprisingly, Mussolini was, of course, aware of opposing views. Fascism was the dominant view in Italy and Nazi Germany during this time, and it was opposed primarily by the Western democracies and, of course, the, communist or Marxist Soviet Union. One of the main ideological enemies of fascism is Marxism. Although historically, the Nazis of Germany and supposed Marxists of the Soviet Union did cooperate quite a bit before the start of World War II, before they became enemies. So what's going on with Marxism? Well, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who bankrolled him, and then later Marxist thinkers like Lenin, not John Lennon, Vladimir Lenin, have written lots and lots and lots on Marxism. So one could spend an entire career studying Marxism and its forms. So what is the super simplified version? Well, here it is. Marxism is a materialist philosophy, specifically in the metaphysical sense. So for a classic Marxist, if you ask them the question, what is reality composed of? They would say matter. And not surprisingly, the Marxists generally tend to be atheists. They explicitly reject God, etc. And so the Marxists take a view of history that holds that you explain what occurs through this conflict between social groups by changes and developments and the means and modes of production. So essentially everything is explained economically. It's called economic determinism. So what is the, going to metaphysics, what is the thing that explains all that is done? Well, for Marx, in terms of us humans, it would be economics. Now, according to Mussolini, the fascists reject this. So they're essentially an explicit rejection of key parts of Marxism. So according to Mussolini, they reject first the economic conception of history. So they reject that. Secondly, at least according to Mussolini, they reject the idea that people are, merely carried along by these economic factors, and that the directing forces are out of human control. So, according to Mussolini, they reject this notion of economic determinism. Now, that's not really like a hallmark of fascism. There are many views that are non-fascist that reject that aspect of Marxism. Now, also key to Marxism, kind of, the central part of, from a practical standpoint, is the notion of class war. So according to the Marxists, again, grossly oversimplifying this, here's how things will play out. So when you get to capitalism, you end up having two classes, broadly speaking. You have the proletariat, the workers, and the bourgeois, the owners. And what Marx predicted is that gradually the bourgeois would own more and more and more, and so people would be pushed out of the bourgeois class into the proletariat class. And then eventually you'd have a hyper-concentration of wealth with a large number of proletariat workers who are poor and a very tiny number of extremely wealthy bourgeois owners. And what would happen, according to Marx, is the proletariat would eventually realize, that they're being screwed over and that there's a lot more of them than there are the bourgeois, and there would be a revolution. And the bourgeois would be killed, except for those who go over to the proletariat side. And then you would have a dictatorship of the proletariat in which you would have socialism, at least Marx's version. And Marx's version of socialism was that you would have a state would own all the modes of production. Now, this doesn't mean that the state would own your underwear and your toothbrush and, you'd have to share your underwear or toothbrush. It means that all the factories and businesses and highways and infrastructure would be owned by the state, to be nationalized. Now, Marx claimed that eventually what would happen is this. Eventually society would become so productive, there would be no need to have an oppressive state anymore. You would need, the dictatorship of the proletariat, because there'd be so much production, so much wealth, that there'd be no need for oppression or controlling people anymore. There'd be no more classes, and you could have Marx's ideal state of communism, in which you wouldn't have a state anymore. And in a grossly oversimplified way to look at this is, he's kind of imagining roughly kind of like the Star Trek future, where human civilization is so wealthy and so advanced, you don't need an oppressive state to keep people in line anymore, or so he claimed. And critics, of course, point out this seems to be very utopian. Now, as you might imagine, the fascists reject that. They reject the notion of class war, and they reject the notion of the state, being withering away, because as we'll see in a bit, the fascists are, at least Mussolini's version, utterly devoted to the state. And so the fascists regard the Marxist as clear competition, and clearly reject the core components of Marxism, namely philosophical materialism, the notion of economic determinism, and the conception of class war, and of course the idea that the state will wither away and be replaced with this ideal communism. Now, in addition to the Marxists, the fascists, not surprisingly, also oppose democracy. Historically, of course, World War II was fought between primarily, the fascist Italy, Germany, and totalitarian Japan against, the Allies, America, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, etc., and of course the Soviet Union. So basically, it was democracy and Marxism against fascism. Now, even before the war began, Mussolini regarded democracy as an enemy of fascism. Why? Well, for the following reasons. The fascist explicitly rejects democracy. Now, again, democracy is a very well-developed, robust theory with thinkers like, John Locke and Rousseau, and so it's a really complicated, philosophical and political view. And it would take, you could spend an entire career studying, democratic political theory. Democrat, small d. I don't mean the political party, I mean the concept of democracy, broadly speaking, including, like republics, etc. So, what does Mussolini regard as the hallmarks, the core of democracy that he as a fascist rejects? Well, the first thing that he rejects is a core concept of democracy, which is majority rule. And the fascist denies that the majority, by the simple fact they're a majority, should not be ruling. So there's a rejection of that explicit aspect of democracy, pretty much the core of it, majority rule. Secondly, voting. Although, the fascists might engage in some form of voting, they deny, essentially the validity of governing by voting. So the core things of democracy so far they reject are majority rule and voting. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone who rejects majority rule is a fascist. It doesn't mean everyone who opposes voting is a fascist, but those are two key aspects. So, though fascists will push against majority rule, especially when they're not in the majority, and they'll tend to reject voting when they're not, in the majority. Another key aspect of democracy is democracies, the United States especially, claim to support the notion of equality. That, explicitly the United States says that all men are created equal. The fascist denies this. So, much like with peace, the fascist claims you can never have equality. You can never get rid of inequality through means like universal suffrage, everyone voting. And so essentially their view of inequality is this: it's always going to be the case. There can be no equality. Now, they also believe that even if you could get rid of inequality, that would be bad, because they regard inequality as a good thing. Now, many characterize fascists as being of necessity, a particular sort of racist. That, for example, in order to be fascist, one has to be anti-Semitic, because in World War II, the form of fascism that occurred in Nazi Germany was largely anti-Semitic. And so someone might say, well, if this group is not explicitly anti-Semitic, they can't be fascist. Well, it's not inherent to fascism that it be, say, anti-Semitic, or anti-Muslim, or anti-Irish, or any particular group. What they do, however, accept is this notion of inequality. So you will find in fascism this notion that inequality is both unavoidable and good. But they'll pick different targets to focus on. So one important thing to note, as other thinkers have pointed out as well, is that there are different forms of fascism. There's not clearly the Germans have their own form, the Italians their own form, and there'll be different forms. So just like you have different manifestations of, say, democracy, you have different manifestations of fascism. And so for the fascist, the main things about democracy that are unacceptable would be majority rule, voting, and of course the idea of equality. They also reject, explicitly, Mussolini taking a shot at the United States, they reject the notion of happiness and indefinite progress. Again, an attack on the United States' notion of pursuit of happiness and the idea of having progression in society. And again, not everyone who opposes progress or happiness would be a fascist, but they tend to explicitly oppose progress. And so that's a quick look at how democracy opposes, they oppose each other, how fascism opposes democracy.